why the narcissist cannot recover after betraying a super empath. And before we go anywhere else, I need you to understand what I mean by cannot, because that word is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this title, and it deserves to be thoroughly unpacked before we build anything on top of it. I do not mean cannot in the way a person cannot lift something far too heavy or cannot solve a technical problem they simply do not have the right tools for. I mean cannot in the way a person cannot unknow something they have already witnessed with their own eyes, cannot unfeel something that has already landed deep within their chest, cannot return to an earlier version of themselves that existed before a particular encounter changed their internal landscape permanently and without any permission whatsoever. A narcissist who betrays a super empath does not walk away clean from the wreckage. They do not move on in the exact way they have effortlessly moved on from everyone else in their past. They do not find the next unsuspecting person and slot seamlessly back into the familiar pattern that has always worked for them before. Something profound happens in the aftermath of this specific betrayal that the narcissist did not see coming at all and cannot fully explain away. And that something is precisely what this entire episode is about. So, if you have ever been a super empath on the receiving end of a narcissist at their absolute worst and watched them apparently sail off into the sunset completely unaffected, I need you to stay right here with me, because what is actually happening underneath that calm surface is one of the most psychologically fascinating and quietly devastating processes in all of human relationship dynamics. The narcissist is desperately hoping you never find out about it. Let us start with the super empath, because you cannot possibly understand what the narcissist loses without first understanding what a super empath actually is in reality. Not in the vague, widely overused way that the word gets thrown around on the internet, but specifically and precisely in a way that explains why this particular person represents something categorically different from every single other target a narcissist has ever chosen in their lifetime. A super empath is not simply someone who feels deep empathy for others. Every ordinary empath feels deeply in their daily life. What separates the super empath from everyone else is not the depth of their feeling alone, but the unique combination of that emotional depth with something the narcissist never anticipated encountering in someone they chose to target. A strong spine and a self-awareness that runs just as deep as the empathy itself. An astonishing ability to absorb, understand, and feel the full weight of another person's complex psychology, including all of their hidden darkness, their calculated manipulation, and their carefully constructed false self, while holding all of that clearly, accurately, and without ever losing themselves in it indefinitely. The super empath is not someone who miraculously never gets hurt by others. They get hurt profoundly, perhaps even more profoundly than most other people do, because of how completely they feel everything around them. But they possess a rare capacity for deep emotional reckoning that eventually and always catches up with what was done to them. And when it finally does, when the super empath's perception fully crystallizes around what the narcissist actually is, what was genuinely happening behind closed doors, what was real, and what was completely manufactured, the quality of that seeing is entirely unlike anything the narcissist has ever been seen with before. It is complete. It is devastatingly accurate. It has no sentimentality left in it whatsoever. And it lands on the narcissist in a way that nothing else in their entire life ever has. Here is what the narcissist understood about every previous relationship they have ever had, whether they were conscious of it or not. Most ordinary people, when they are deeply hurt by a narcissist, leave. The relationship with their perception of the narcissist still somewhat intact. They leave feeling deeply confused. They leave with some version of the relationship mythology still running in the background of their minds. The comforting idea that somewhere underneath everything that went wrong, there was still something genuine, something truly worth the pain, and some real version of the person they fell in love with that the harsh circumstances just did not allow to fully emerge. They leave with enough lingering uncertainty about what actually happened that the narcissist retains the incredible ability to rewrite the entire story, to play the role of the innocent victim of the ending rather than the actual architect of the damage, and to construct a neat narrative in the social circles that matter to them, where the person who left was simply flawed, unstable, or just not the right fit all along. This careful rewriting is never a small thing for a narcissist. It is absolute survival. It is the vital ability to control the narrative around every single ending, so they never have to be the unambiguous villain of any story. It is the need to always have a clean version of events that protects the fragile self-image they simply cannot survive without. This is how narcissists effortlessly move through their entire relational history without ever accumulating the kind of genuine accountability that would force real personal change. Every single ending that can be successfully spun is an ending that costs them nothing at the psychological level that matters to them the most. The super empath does not leave the relationship this way at all. When a super empath finally reaches the absolute end of their capacity to endure a narcissistic relationship, and it is always a gradual process rather than a sudden snap, always the result of a slow and thorough accumulation of undeniable evidence that the person they are with is fundamentally not capable of what a healthy relationship requires, what they take with them on the way out is not confusion. It is pure, piercing clarity. A specific, comprehensive, and unflattering clarity about exactly what the narcissist is, exactly how the psychological manipulation worked, exactly which moments were genuine and which were entirely performed, exactly what they were originally chosen for, and exactly how they were used as instruments. This clarity is built from the exact same perceptive apparatus that made the super empath so deeply appealing to the narcissist in the very beginning. The uncanny ability to read people at great depth, to understand human motivations hiding beneath the surface presentation, and to track recurring patterns across time with an accuracy that most people never develop in their entire lives. The narcissists spend the entirety of the relationship happily benefiting from being understood so exceptionally well. They completely fail to anticipate that that exact same profound understanding would eventually turn itself toward the full picture of what they actually did and produce a final verdict that left absolutely no room for revision or debate. And this verdict, this quiet, devastatingly accurate, and completely unsentimental understanding of exactly who the narcissist is and exactly what they did is what the narcissist takes with them when the super empath finally walks away for good. They do not take the super empath's physical presence, nor their comforting warmth, nor their extraordinary emotional depth, nor their rare capacity to make someone feel known in a way that nothing else can ever compare to. What they are forced to take with them is the haunting knowledge that someone saw them all the way through to the end. Past the dazzling charm, past the elaborate construction, past the carefully maintained false self, past the intense love bombing, past the confusing gaslighting, and past the desperate narrative control, all the way down to what was actually sitting there in the dark. And what was actually there was seen clearly, held accurately, understood completely, and still found to be utterly insufficient, still found to be completely worth leaving behind. The narcissist has certainly been rejected before in their life. They have been left by partners many times before. But they have almost never been truly seen before. Not like this, and never with this terrifying quality of absolute accuracy. And the profound rejection that comes from being fully and completely seen and still not chosen operates on a completely different register than any rejection they have ever previously experienced in their existence. It does not just sting the ego in the familiar, temporary way that previous relationship endings stung it. It penetrates something much deeper and much more dangerous. Something the narcissist has spent their entire life building elaborate psychological structures to protect at all costs. The terrifying, never examined, and always defended core question of whether they are actually enough as a human being and whether there is anything genuinely worth knowing underneath everything they constantly perform for the world. And the super empath's exit, carrying that clear-eyed verdict away with them, answers that lingering question in a way that the narcissist cannot argue with, cannot reframe successfully, and cannot spin into something more comfortable to live with. Because the super empath saw too much and saw it far too clearly for any convenient spin to ever stick, even inside the narcissist's own private internal narrative. This is precisely where the inability to recover actually begins its slow work. Because every single coping mechanism that a narcissist has ever successfully deployed in the aftermath of a relationship ending requires a certain amount of narrative flexibility. It requires that the story of what actually happened can be shaped at least partially into something that reflects favorably on them, or at the very least presents them neutrally to the world. But the super empath leaves with the unvarnished, real story, not a bitter, exaggerated, or emotionally reactive version of the story, but the cold and accurate version. And the narcissist privately knows deep down that it is entirely accurate, which is the exact part that makes it completely impossible to dismiss entirely from their mind. Even in private, even in the quietest moments when no one else is watching them, and the exhausting performance of being perfectly fine is temporarily switched off, the reality remains. In those lonely moments, the knowledge that someone understood exactly what they were doing and consciously chose to leave it all behind anyway arrives without any of the soft cushioning that normal psychological denial usually provides. Because the super empath's crystal clear perception does not leave even a tiny crack of room for the narcissist to convince even themselves that it was all just a terrible misunderstanding or that they were simply misread by an unstable person. They know that if the super empath had just seen them differently, the outcome might have been different. But the painful truth is that the super empath saw them completely correctly all along. The final outcome reflects that precise truth with brutal honesty. And the narcissist, sitting entirely alone with that heavy reality in the quiet hours they desperately try to fill with endless distractions, finds something sitting there that they have absolutely no established method for metabolizing. What they find hiding in that silence, and what it inevitably does to every single relationship they attempt to build after this one, and why the pattern that has always reliably rebuilt their shattered ego after previous relationships completely fails to work this time around, forms the rest of the story. That is the hidden story that explains everything about why betraying a super empath is the one singular thing a narcissist genuinely cannot walk away from unchanged. And that is precisely where we are heading next in our story. What they find hidden in those quiet moments that the narcissist works harder than almost anyone realizes to never have to sit inside is something that does not have a comfortable name in the vocabulary of someone who has spent their entire life avoiding any real self-examination. It is not guilt in the way an ordinary person with a fully developed conscience experiences guilt with its accompanying natural impulse toward accountability, toward repair, and toward the genuine desire to have been different. It is something much more disorienting than standard guilt, and in many ways much more corrosive because it is closer to raw recognition. A recognition that arrives completely without the machinery of empathy that would normally allow them to process it constructively. It arrives without the vital self-awareness that would allow them to do something useful with it, and without the emotional tools that would allow them to integrate it into a coherent understanding of who they actually are and what they desperately need to change. It arrives as a raw, unprocessed, knowing that sits heavily right in the center of them with nowhere else to go. The haunting knowing that the one person who understood them completely, not the performed version, not the charming version, and not the version constructed specifically to elicit admiration and supply, but the one person who saw all the way down to what was actually there, decided that what was actually there was simply not something they could stay for another day. And unlike every previous person who left them, the super empath cannot be easily dismissed as someone who simply did not understand them well enough. The super empath understood them better than anyone else ever had. That was the whole problem. That is the entire problem that never goes away. So what does the narcissist do with this unbearable weight? Because a narcissist without some kind of active coping strategy is simply not something that ever happens in reality. They will always reach for something, always find some mechanism for managing what cannot be integrated into their fragile psyche. The very first thing they reach for is a replacement, which is what they always reach for first. The familiar logic that the deep ache of one person's absence can be quickly resolved by the physical presence of another. And they find someone new, usually quite quickly, because the narcissist's underlying ability to attract people has not diminished at all. The superficial charm still works on fresh targets. The intense love bombing still lands with devastating effectiveness. The initial phase of a brand new relationship still produces that quick hit of admiration and attention that temporarily quiets the rising noise inside their head. And for a while, maybe lasting a few weeks or maybe a few months, the replacement strategy appears to be working the exact way it always has in the past. They feel the familiar forward momentum of a fresh dynamic, the sweet relief of having supply again, and the comfortable mental reset that a fresh start with a brand new person has always provided before. But something is profoundly different this time underneath the quiet surface of the new relationship in the private experience of the narcissist. When the initial newness quiets down enough for genuine comparison to become possible, the new person simply does not see them the way the super empath saw them. And somehow, despite the fact that being seen, that clearly was ultimately what exposed them and contributed to their total undoing, the complete absence of it in the new relationship creates a strange flatness they were never prepared to handle. A low-grade dissatisfaction that sits underneath the new supply like static underneath music, always present, always slightly ruining the experience, and impossible to fully tune out no matter what they do. This is the specific psychological trap that the betrayed super empath leaves the narcissist trapped inside. And it is not something the super empath designed or intended or is sitting somewhere orchestrating with malicious satisfaction. It is simply the natural consequence of having been a certain quality of profound presence in someone's life, because the super empath, for all the pain of the relationship, for all the ways the dynamic was completely broken, and for the heavy cost that was borne almost entirely by her alone, also gave the narcissist something they have received from no one else and will receive from no one else in quite the same way. The rare experience of being genuinely, deeply, and accurately known. Not flattered, not idealized, and not performing for an audience that only sees the surface, but actually known for who they are. And that unique experience, even in the hands of someone who exploited it, weaponized it, and ultimately could not tolerate the heavy accountability it implied, leaves a permanent mark. Because the fundamental human need to be truly known is not exclusive to people with healthy psychologies. The narcissist has that exact same need buried deep under layers of defense, endless performance, and the elaborate false self constructed to protect the weeping wound underneath. They have that desperate need, and yet they have almost never had it met, because the kind of profound knowing the super empath brought to the relationship requires the person being known to actually be willing to be seen. And the narcissist has spent their entire life engineering the exact opposite of that vulnerability. Except with the super empath somehow, briefly, imperfectly, and terrifyingly, they were seen anyway. And now that it is completely gone, the deafening absence of it is much louder than they ever expected it to be. Louder than anything the new supply can possibly drown out. Now, this is precisely where the inability to recover moves from being about the loss of the super empath, specifically into being about something the narcissist carries permanently into everything that comes after. Because the recognition that arrived in those quiet moments, the raw, unprocessed knowing about themselves that the super empath's clear-eyed exit deposited somewhere they can never reach to remove, starts doing something the narcissist has absolutely no mental framework for managing. It starts quietly contaminating the performance, not visibly, and not in ways that are immediately obvious to new people who simply do not have the context to notice the difference, but in small, private ways that the narcissist registers with a deep discomfort they cannot even name. The love bombing feels slightly more mechanical than it used to feel. The construction of the false self requires slightly more daily effort than it used to require. The moments right after a successful manipulation, which used to produce a clean and satisfying hit of victory, now produce something slightly murkier. It is not quite guilt, but it is certainly adjacent to it. It is something that asks a lingering question the narcissist has zero interest in answering, but cannot entirely silence either. The super empath's unwavering clarity, carried out of the relationship in her absolute understanding of exactly what he was doing and how and why he was doing it, has somehow lodged itself permanently inside his own personal experience of doing it. She saw the exact mechanism, and now, because she saw it so completely and so accurately, he cannot fully unsee it from the inside anymore. The old trick simply does not work as cleanly when some vital part of you is now aware against your own will that it is nothing more than a trick. This is uncharted psychological territory that the narcissist has never occupied before in their life and has absolutely no map for navigating. Every single previous relationship they left, ended, or destroyed gave them at the very absolute minimum the intact ability to move forward as their familiar self. The performed self, the constructed self, and the reliable self that had been working smoothly in the world for as long as they could possibly remember. The super empath's betrayal, meaning the narcissist's own profound betrayal of the super empath, has compromised that ability in a way they can never fully repair, even if it has not completely destroyed them. A narcissist's psychological defenses are admittedly formidable. Their false self is surprisingly resilient, and their deep capacity for denial runs both wide and deep. But their core has been compromised and slightly cracked, and a hidden crack in the foundation of a human structure built entirely on outward performance is never a small thing. It is the precise place where the whole architecture becomes, for the very first time in their lives, slightly untrustworthy, slightly unreliable, and slightly less certain to hold together under the heavy weight it was originally built to carry. And what this ultimately produces in the narcissist, who will never admit it out loud and may never even fully and consciously recognize it, is a persistent haunting. Not in the dramatic, gothic sense of the word, but in the quiet, unrelenting psychological sense. It is the constant presence of something lingering in the background of everything they do that simply was not there before. The super empath haunts them, not because she was magically perfect, or because the toxic relationship was genuinely healthy, or because what they shared together was the grand love story, that the narcissist may sometimes rewrite it as in their faulty memory. She haunts them simply because she was real. Because in a life built almost entirely on shallow surfaces, endless performances, and the careful management of other people's perceptions, she represented something that could never be managed or controlled. She was a genuine encounter with a human being who refused to be fooled, who could not be permanently deceived, and who absorbed everything he brought to the table and eventually, quietly, and clearly handed it right back to him with her departure, effectively saying, "I see exactly what this is, and I choose much better than this for myself." That unforgettable moment of being chosen against, not from any temporary confusion or hurt or a failure to understand what he truly was, but stemming from a complete and accurate understanding of exactly what he was, is the single moment the narcissist can never move past, can never fully metabolize, and can never spin into something that restores what it took from them. Because what it took away was not just her physical presence. It took away their last remaining ability to fully and blindly believe their own elaborate performance. And without that absolute belief, true recovery to the exact version of themselves that existed before she saw straight through it is not something that is ever coming back. It is something that was permanently, quietly, and irrevocably foreclosed the very moment she walked out the door, carrying the naked truth of them far more clearly than they have ever been able to carry it themselves.